What are the three things or maybe a checklist for how can I know that I want to be a coach?
I would say you need to be deeply curious about human psychology, what makes people tick, why people do what they do. Second, I would say is listening. I think people around you should feel that you're a good listener. Coaching is much more about, it's a sort of 85% listening and 50% speaking. Third, I would say is your willingness to work on yourself. Very few people talk about this.
Pretty deep.
But this is something I learned from a gentleman called Rajiv Vij, who's a coach I respect, who's based in Singapore. And he said your ability to add value to others is directly proportional to your ability to work on yourself.
Folks, welcome to Paisa Paisa. I'm your host Anupam Gupta, and on today's episode, as part of a sub-series on how businesses work, my guest Deepak Jayaraman, coach, sounding board, author, podcaster. We're going to talk about the business of executive coaching, Deepak's latest book, and much more. Deepak, welcome to Paisa Paisa. Thank you so much for doing this for our audience.
Thank you, Anupam. Thank you for having me.
It is fantastic to have you here because author, podcaster, and much more. Let's start with your journey. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I don't think I've met anyone who is a coach in my years of podcasting, or even among people that I know. So let's start from there.
And thank you, Anupam. It's been an organic journey. I would say I come from the Indian middle class, grew up in Tamil Nadu and various parts in tier 2, tier 3 towns. Father was a public sector banker. So I think I come from a family where the belief was you go after Saraswati and hopefully Lakshmi will follow at some point. So I was lucky to be put in a good school, grateful for my parents' choice. That took me to IIT Madras and IIM Ahmedabad. In a way, I would say peer momentum took me to those places. And even there, I saw myself as a problem-solving person. Took me to KPMG Consulting. Wanted to pursue a global career. That took me to LBS, London Business School. Got a chance to work with McKinsey in the US. So I would say I would put all this as a striving to work hard, striving to excel, which many people would relate to. I think 2008 was a turning point for me. My father, based in Chennai, was diagnosed with cancer. So my wife and we came back and took care of the treatment. McKinsey was kind enough to let me work out of India in that phase. But unfortunately, it was stage 4. We could only palliate. He passed away in 6 months. But when it was time for me to go back to the US, Lehman had happened. The US economy wasn't going anywhere. The the consultants in the New Jersey office, which is where I worked, were on the beach. So the general advice I got was just stay wherever you are. Don't try coming back to the US. The doors were shut. So one of my mentors at that time, Ramesh Mangaleshwaran, he introduced me to Egon Zehnder. He said, you seem to have a passion for the people side of things. You know, in McKinsey, the consultants were looked at along 3 dimensions, IQ, CQ, and RQ. IQ is intellect and problem solving. CQ is the toolkit of a consultant, which is client management, project planning, structuring a problem, etc. RQ is relationship quotient. And everyone would spike in one dimension. My spike was emerging to be RQ.
Nice.
So Ramesh said, why don't you double down on what makes you distinctive and consider search? So he introduced me to a gentleman called Egon Zehnder, Govind Iyer, who was a managing partner at Egon Zehnder. So met the Indian consultants, 10 of them. They asked me to meet 20 consultants from other offices to check for culture fit. And then after 30 odd conversations, joined Egon Zehnder. Did that for 6 years, but along the way I realized I was enjoying the candidate counseling conversations more than the client conversations. And one of my friends actually looked at me and said, you seem to have more of a coaching orientation than a poaching orientation. And I think they're 2 different sort of mindsets, if you will. So I in 2016, 6 years later, I moved away from the recruitment world to sort of broadly be in the business of helping people.
Sure.
Again, it's an ocean, but I said, let me pick a niche where I become the go-to person over time. So I picked transitions because I felt as a search consultant, every candidate conversation was a career transition conversation. And every client conversation was a leadership transition conversation.
Yeah.
So I felt I had a sort of a unique skill set in that domain. So started working on transitions, and the other advice I got was if you want to play the long game, you need to create some brand of sorts or some IP of sorts. So that set off the Play to Potential podcast in 2016. Over time, I think people started reaching out to me saying, I'm not necessarily in a transition. Just help me play to potential in my role. So now where things stand, I feel helping people play to potential is sort of my overall mission statement. And there are three legs to that statement. One is the advisory work.
Yeah.
Second is a podcast. And third is now the book.
Fantastic.
So that's where things are.
So let's go into coaching, right? I mean, I have a vague idea because I had worked with Saurabh on his book Unfiltered, which is also about his journey with his coach. So I have an idea about that. But if you were to introduce a concept of executive coaching to our audience, what exactly is it? And especially since you, within the very huge ambit of executive coaching, you focus towards transition, I'm assuming. So,
It started there, but now it's gone beyond.
yeah.
But I think without overcomplicating it, Anupam, I think we intuitively understand what a coach does in the world of sport. Right?
That's the most natural understanding of the word coach.
Exactly. And it's not too different from that. I mean, the coach helps, let's say if we take a coach of Roger Federer, when Stefan Edberg was coaching him, his role is to make Roger Federer a better player, whatever that took, right? It means maybe there's an element of mental conditioning, maybe there's an element of training, maybe there's an element of match preparation, whatever it took. So at the most fundamental level, I feel a coach is somebody that helps a person to become a better version of themselves. The other element that's often associated with the word coaching is you sort of help the person find his or her own answer rather than spoon feeding that person. Very often, this is where it gets into discussions around what is mentorship, what is coaching. Very often, I mean, the one question is what's mentoring, what's coaching. Very often, mentoring is often seen as somebody who's had a lot of experience in one domain, and you go to that person with a problem and they'll say, this is how the answer should be. But a coach is generally a little more, inquiry-led and helps the person find the answers. And the idea is, hopefully, the person over time becomes self-sufficient and self-resilient as they go through the journey. So in simple terms, back to what you said, Anupam, trying to help people become a better version of themselves. But again, there are different ways in which you could do it.
What is the process like? I mean, is there a formal accreditation or training or certification of any sort? I mean, if one decides, and in your case, I think you'd spend the better part of 10 years in a specific industry before you decide to branch off and pursue this, right? So is there any training required for this or certification?
There is. And there are, for example, there's the International Coaching Federation, ICF, which conducts coaching certification programs. Similarly, there are many bodies, and there are many which are accredited with the ICF. For example, Marshall Goldsmith, who's a very highly celebrated coach, he has a certification methodology. There's another institute called Ericsson, which runs programs. There's one called Center for Creative Leadership, which has its program. So I think there is an organization which sort of sets a little bit of the curriculum, if you will. And there are different people delivering minor variants of the curriculum. I did my certification from a place called Coaching Foundation of India. CFI, which is based in Chennai, run by a gentleman called Ganesh Chella and the late Pradipta Mohapatra. That's not necessarily a part of ICF, but when I was looking to get certified, the advice I got was go for a program that's sort of is the highest on the learning front. So I went for this. But to your question, yes, there is some sort of certification required. But I think what's also happening, Anupam, I must mention, is the coaching industry is also seeing it's adjacent to many spaces, right? It's adjacent to health. It's adjacent to, if you may say, counseling.
Therapy.
So therapy, counseling. So these are all gray areas, and sometimes people from other domains start calling themselves coach. So it's a tricky one. It's a sort of I would say, it's a porous boundary. It's not a very clear cut.
So I want to take this question on both sides of the table. Let's take someone who's watching this right now and he's thinking, maybe I want to do this. What's your advice to him as a career?
As a practitioner, I think
maybe start with you need to spend time first working like you did. I mean, it just sounds like this is not something that you can do straight out of college.
That's true.
Go on.
That's true. So I think there are many pathways to this, right? And there are, in my case, I happen to work as a consultant for a while and moved into this in sort of an advisory services kind of a mindset. There are some people who come in from a counseling kind of a mindset or a degree in psychology, saying I'm in the, or, any of the related disciplines to say I get a lot of energy from helping people. I think the key is to ensure that you find the right platform. I think what sometimes I find people underestimate is, yes, you can skill up and become a great coach, but where will the leads come from? Where will the revenue come from? Can you associate yourself with a platform that will take care of that in the initial years and then branch off on your own? I think that's the piece I find that very often people significantly underthink and underestimate.
Yeah.
So I think that's the piece to think through.
And now the more interesting part to me, okay, which I've had like so many conversations with a lot of CEOs, C-suite people. When do I know that I need a coach? If at all, that's even a question.
It's a good question, Anupam. And in a way, there is the way the question is framed, it suggests that you come to a coach for a problem or a situation.
That's what I'm talking about, right?
Right. So I
There's
think
already some amount of baggage.
Correct. I think what I'm also seeing, and this is an evolution in the Indian space as well, is, to use very broad language, you can have a coach to help you from being stuck to being good, or you can have a coach from being good to becoming great, right? So very often people associate coaching with the former, saying there's some problem, fix it, maybe give the person a coach.
It's not a good place to start from, right?
Not a good place to start from, and very often there's too much water under the bridge. What I found paradoxically enough, if I look at sort of the clients I work with, in a way, a lot of them are actually doing very well you could call them in the 80th percentile or 90th percentile, but they want to chip away at the remaining 10% and really become a better version of themselves. Of course, that's not to say, the coaching is not relevant here. Each person needs to find a niche. But I think the prerequisite for that is the person needs to say, I want help.
Yes.
Sort of loosely speaking, I use the phrase, right? Houston, he has a problem, doesn't work. The starting point has to be Houston, I have a problem. And then you can say maybe a coach can help. But yeah.
Because the thing is that once there's someone who reaches that C-suite level or, even a seniorish level, there is this confidence that I am everything.
That is true.
And it's because I am good at what I do that my organization has rewarded me.
That is true.
So how could I, need...
But what also happens that people sometimes underestimate is that as you rise to the top, clearly you're doing a few things right, which is why you get there. But very often you also stop receiving good quality signals. The world around you either goes quiet or you hear a lot of noise because people are posturing to you. So you stop hearing what exactly is working well and where are some of the blind spots. So I think that's where people who are a little more curious and have a certain humility about this are able to tune into that and sort of chip away at that.
I mean, in developed markets like the US and Europe, this is an established field for a long time.
That is true.
Someone like Marshall Goldsmith has been, I think, doing this for the better part of his career.
That is true.
Not,
I think from at least early, again, I may not have the exact number, but early 1900s, mid 1900s, Peter Drucker. We've had many legends who've been sort of thinkers in the space and sort of practitioners of the space. I mean, one could argue in a place like India, someone like a Dronacharya or even a Krishna. Right?
Oh, what a great example.
Yeah, Krishna at the end of the day was an executive coach for Arjuna, if you really apply that frame. But sometimes we sort of compartmentalize these things. But the principles of Bhagavad Gita, fascinatingly enough, is arguably the most read textbook when it comes to wisdom beyond the here and now.
And we've had that forever.
Correct. So it's a function of where we draw the line.
Okay. Now, I want to get to two things, profile and process, which is first is what is the profile of your clients?
See, in my case, I end up working with leaders of organizations and typically either these could be promoters of companies, they could be MDs of organizations, or they could be investors, general partners of a VC fund or a PE fund, etc. That's sort of one cohort. The second cohort, I would say, is leaders in transition. People who are sort of trying to figure out what next. Just like businesses need to think about where to play, how to win, I think we all have to be deliberate about where to go and how to grow. Yeah. So given my focus on transitions, initial focus on transitions, there is a segment of people who are solving where to go, who've climbed a mountain. Now they're saying, what's the next mountain to climb? Or maybe should I go river rafting somewhere or whatever? Ask all those philosophical questions. So that would sort of be the broad, and I've chosen not to build a large organization. So it's my time, which is on the advisory side.
Sure. So
I work with about 7 to 10 people at any point in time.
Okay.
And sort of it's a deeply immersive process.
Yeah. So folks, here's the thing where, I know that for me, at least at various points of my career, even early on, not necessarily when you're a senior or a C-suite person, the whole transition thing is it just kind of draws you because you know that maybe you're disillusioned with the job and you're figuring where to go in the next job, then I think that's, if you're in that boat, my suggestion is just check out Deepak's book. We'll be getting to that in a short while. Deepak, what is the coaching process like? Okay, this is like endlessly fascinating for me. I'm hearing it for the very first time. What is the process? Where does it start? Like, let's say I'm a client, I walk into your office, we engage, we sign whatever is your contract. What happens next?
Again, varies from case to case, Anupam. In some cases, for example, organizations will reach out to a coach and say, here is the coaching agenda. Here's leader X who needs coaching.
The organization reaches out.
So in some cases,
Very
again,
interesting.
in my case, I'll come to my case in a minute,
Yeah.
but I want to sort of paint the diversity of the ways in which it can be structured. One is the organization reaches out, maybe the CHRO or the MD reaches out to the coach saying, here's a person who needs coaching. Here's the coaching agenda. We've done a feedback. We think the person needs to be, let's say, more assertive or take more risk, whatever. They'll frame a development need, and then they'll assign the coach, and then they will say, okay, why don't you work for a period of 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and work with the coachee and move the person up the curve. That's definitely a large category of how coaching is done. In my case, I like to see myself, Anupam, as a coach and a sounding board. And at least my starting point very often is the way the problem is stated, and what the problem is sometimes can be different things. Sometimes people come to me with X, but the issue turns out to be Y. So I tell them, let's engage for a period of time. For the first 3 to 6 months, let me put you through some sort of a journaling process, right? Some sort of a reflection, internal self-awareness process. Second, let me talk to 20, 30 people around you.
Wow.
This could be your current colleagues, past colleagues, spouse, sibling, friends. Because for me, especially when people are around 40 and 50, unlocks don't come from work. If I want to really get to know the person and what drives the person, sometimes useful data comes from other domains, especially from home, because that's when people are able to tell me when do they come alive, what really frustrates them, what gives them a high, etc. So after 6 months, then we sort of look at what's coming up, and I show the mirror. We go through it together, and then I engage on a certain frequency, right? It could be a session every 2 weeks or a session a month, and really engage on whatever is coming up. For example, I'm working with an entrepreneur who's in the foods business, right? Initial few discussions, maybe the first few quarters, were around his journey. Should I build it? Should I sort of commit to the business? Should I sell it off? Should I do philanthropy, etc.? Then it moved on to, okay, I want to sort of really commit to this business. I want to grow it from, let's say, 200 crores to 1,000 crores over a period of time. Then he said, I need to bring a leader. What kind of a leader do I hire? Then the sessions were around recruitment. Since I've done recruitment, I'm able to add value to those conversations. Now that leader has come in, now he's sort of beginning to say, should I attract institutional capital? What sort of a fund should I work with, etc., etc. So I think my objective is to sort of, again, the phrase I like to use is, you have the sage on the stage who's the CEO. You have the guide on the side who's the sort of person who comes for a period of time. My role is to be the guide on the ride. Once you know the context, then in most of my clients, typically the journeys are, 2 years, 3 years and counting. Because just like money, trust compounds. And once you have the trust and you have the context, then the clients say, why don't we just stay the path? Because as you know more and more about me, your ability to add nuanced value to me increases. So that's been my approach.
Wow. So your engagement runs for years.
Typically, again, it sort of moves to a low touch model. But the point is, there is just so much trust and so much context. Why, and I tell the clients, we'll stop the clock whenever you stop perceiving value. Because it's hard for me to tell when am I stopping to add value.
Sure.
So I leave the ball in the other court to say, here's the remote control. Whenever you think we are hitting diminishing returns, you hit the stop or the pause, and we'll shake hands. And we'll reconnect whenever it's important.
So for the better part of 8 years, I'm assuming you started in 2016-ish,
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
You would have covered like what, even if you're doing 10 clients a year, which I think is on the higher side.
I must say, this is also part of evolution, right? Initially, it was 6-month projects with people on a certain coaching agenda. I would say the last 3 odd years have been a little more of this, if I may say, it's a bit like the equivalent of the venture capital model.
Sure.
The venture capitalist says, I'm in the business of expanding your economic capital by engaging for a period of 5-6 years. I'm saying I'm in the business of expanding your human capital by engaging with you for a period of 5 years.
Okay.
But I think that's only a last 2-3 year phenomenon. I think if I look at the 8 year, I would say somewhere in the 50 to 100 CEOs, CXOs is a number that comes to mind.
And I'm guessing fees are paid at milestone levels, performance based, or?
So there is and even that's a journey, right? Initially, the fees was based on activities. I would say I will do this phase, data gathering, feedback, etc. Now it's a little more of a retainer. And I say, it's hard for me to discern the value I add upfront. So I leave it at a discretionary bonus to say, we engage for a period of time. Whenever you stop the clock, if you think I've added value beyond whatever I've charged you, then we leave it at that. For example, one of the early clients I worked with, it's somebody we spoke about him. I don't want to talk about it publicly.
Sure, of course.
But there was an element of helping him think through transition choices. But I think it so turned out that I helped him land the next role by preparing him well. And he said, why don't I see this as a search consultant where, just like we pay a search consultant X percentage of compensation, I would like to think of this on a similar front. And he sort of paid a discretionary sort of X percentage of the first year compensation as a bonus.
Yeah.
So I realized that the value you add in their life, in their currency, is very different from the value you see in your currency as you think about the opportunity cost of your time. So I leave it as a discretionary amount they can choose to pay. It's hard to quantify it upfront.
Very interesting. So I want to wrap up this first part because we're going to now move to your book.
Sure.
I want to wrap up this first part with maybe a few summary points for our audience. I think the first one of that would be, what are the 3 things or maybe a checklist for how can I know that I want to be a coach? Right? And typically this decision should drop on you when? Okay, so maybe just a small checklist on that. What makes for a great person to be a coach?
That's a good question, Anupam. I would say you need to be deeply curious about human psychology, what makes people tick, why people do what they do. I think in general, you need to be curious about people. And
just saying I'm a people watcher is not enough.
Nice.
Because a lot of people like to say that. I mean, people just...
It should give you energy. I think does it energize you? Are you the kind of person that really... Second, I would say is listening. I think people around you should feel that you're a good listener. Right? I think coaching is much more about, it's a sort of 85% listening and 15% speaking. Third, I would say is your willingness to work on yourself. Very few people talk about this.
Pretty deep.
But this is something I learned from a gentleman called Rajiv Vij, who's a coach I respect, who's based in Singapore. And he said your ability to add value to others is directly proportional to your ability to work on yourself. And I think that's an element a lot of people miss.
Amazing.
For example, one of the reasons I started the podcast in a way was saying, if I don't learn and stay on top of what's happening in this space of leadership and transitions, just sort of trying to wing it with my credentials is not going to cut it. So do you have a little bit of a growth mindset yourself? And what is the work you've done on yourself? To me, would be the third thing.
I think growth mindset is I would still say it's more of a generic feel-good phrase. I think working on yourself is challenging.
Yes.
How much challenging.
What work have you done on yourself? Is a useful question to ask.
It's not a path that most of us would even want to venture in, leave alone accepting that I need to work on myself.
Exactly. Okay. So very often it's seen as helping the other, but are you helping yourself to qualify to help the other?
Fascinating. And second is, what's your message to the people who need coaching? Like, one of my favorite points is always that doesn't get along with people. Organizations kind of figure that this guy on his own is brilliant. Hits all the 6s and 4s and gets the team home, etc. But not really, that good. And that's when some kind of andar ghanti bajta hai ki chalo, let's do,
I think there are many reasons for which people need coaching help, right? I think, for example, doesn't get along well with people. I think comes very early in people's career, right? In the first 3-4 years, you could argue you're an individual contributor. But when you start leading teams, when you're 5 years in, 3 years in, this starts beginning to matter. The other piece, which I often call it as the invisible glass ceiling, is that people often are good at leading people under them, but people struggle to collaborate with people like them. So, for example, You might be a very good functional finance person. So you will rise to become the CFO. But once you become the CFO, suddenly you're interacting with a CMO who's as bright, CHRO who's as bright or even brighter, head of sales, head of legal. And the muscle you need to interact with people like yourselves is very different. You can't teach them what to do. You can't bully them. You can't boss them. So suddenly I find a lot of people, and by that time it's already too late because you're really extremely sharp. People have been listening to you because you've often been the brightest person in the room. But now you're surrounded with people like yourself, and that calibration can be hard. So of course there are many coaching agendas, but I'm saying even this people doesn't get along with people often splits into two. People like you and people different from you.
There's this myth, I don't know, a story or whatever that goes about how I think there was a company where people were being fired and there's a top performer who was fired and there was one obscure guy who was not fired. And when they came to know as to why this happened, they were told that that obscure guy is actually the consensus builder because he has worked with everyone in every team. He never takes the limelight. But he's an asset. Whereas this guy got the boot, So I just found that like so fascinating. Because I remember that, and I come from an industry where individual performance is always rewarded.
And there's no feedback, right? I think you're also
and there's no feedback.
There's almost
they
zero
assume that feedback is salary and bonus.
Yeah, feedback is a check, and that's not helpful for behavioral change.
Yeah, I would love to explore that as a separate episode. But last question: who do you look up to as great coaches?
I mentioned a few minutes back Rajiv Vij, who's based in Singapore. He's a coach I respect a lot. There's a gentleman called Bill Campbell, who's often informally called the
that's the
$1 trillion coach.
I was just going to come to that.
So I'd spoken to somebody about him. So again, I haven't met him, but generally what I've heard about him, sometimes, you don't need to meet the person, but there are these things you learn about the person. Sometimes movie characters, right? For me, Robin Williams' character in Good Will Hunting, to me is somebody who inspires me, right? In a way, that was one of the reasons I got into this business. I won't say business, but in this profession.
There's a lot of pain in that character, by the way, and you know that.
There is pain, but the point is he's striving to lead an authentic life and striving to make a difference and striving to live life on his terms and not succumb to what the society expects of him.
What a great movie reference. Okay.
True.
Rajiv Vij, Bill Campbell, Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting.
Correct. Those are the three names that come to mind. Of course, there are many leaders who I feel are great coaches. For example, one individual I respect a lot, he's a mentor. He's the MD of Sundaram Finance, Rajiv Lochan. So I find him to be an exceptional coach. He may not be sort of pursuing coaching as a profession, but he's a great coach as a business leader. He's got a coaching style, which I respect a lot, and I've gained a lot from.
Deepak, your book, your very first book, congratulations.
Thank you.
I think it's got all the makings of a bestseller, so I really hope that you get there.
Thank you.
What drove you to it?
See, as we were discussing earlier, Anupam, the Play to Potential journey started in 2016, where I said, let me try and go on a learning journey for life around leadership, transitions and careers. And it gave me an opportunity to talk to people from different walks of life, sports persons like Vijay Amritraj, Vishy Anand, Viren Raskina, CEOs like Nandan Nilekani, Vinita Bali, investors like Avnish Bajaj, Karthik Reddy, and so on. And slowly I was also able to talk to some of the leading thinkers in the West. Thinkers 50 people like Dan Pink, Herminia Ibarra, Harvard and Wharton professors, and so on and so forth. And I saw this as a long-term journey. But I must say, Rajiv Lochan, who I spoke about, and Prakash Iyer, another gentleman I like and respect, provoked me to say, why don't you consider writing a book? And actually 3 years back, I spoke to the folks at Penguin and they said, why don't you write a book? And I felt I wasn't ready because I wasn't sure if I had anything distinctive to say. Then I went for my 25-year reunion at IIT Madras 2 years back. And some of my classmates around me started asking me, when is the book coming out? So somewhere I felt maybe this was a sign that there's an opportunity to put something out. So it started from there. Then I started writing it. Initially, my thought was to actually structure it as essays on playing to potential, where I sort of capture some of the wisdom from the podcast. But I would say a couple of people made a big difference. One is Vivek Khemka, who's a consultant at Egon Zehnder and a friend. He said, is it just a string of pearls or is there a Deepak recipe in the book? So it got me thinking to say, what is it original that I'm trying to say? Is it just a compilation of things or is there a Deepak's point of view on something? And second is a lady called Shweta Mani, who acted as my coach and sounding board in the writing process. And she actually said, what exactly do you mean by potential? It can mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
And working with her, I felt got me to a point to say, the topic I want to explore is potential in a holistic sense, not just in the context of work.
Sure.
Very often we use the word high potential, low potential in the context of work. But what about human potential? I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a coach, I like to play the guitar, I'm an author, I'm a podcaster. So I said, maybe there's an opportunity to put something out which gives language to people to play to their full potential. And when I looked around, most arrows were pointing to Ikigai as a way of life to lead a full, rich, fulfilling life. And I've benefited a lot from it. But somehow I felt it was too high level.
Yeah.
The
So
phrase.
you spend a good part of your book talking about
Yeah,
that.
the phrase I use is a North Star can't do the job of a torchlight.
Yeah.
They are two different things meant for different purposes. So that's in a way the path to the book.
Midlife. What makes it so unique? Again, you start your book from that point, and
Yes.
the people also, the profiles of the people that you work with are also toward that.
Yes.
What makes it so unique? And I'm asking this question, folks, so that, maybe if you're someone who's starting your career, maybe you know what to expect 10, 20 years down the line.
See, I think midlife is where I feel there are a few things at play. One is I feel we go through a triple whammy. We are often peaking at work. Kids' attention from us is often the need from us is the highest. And parents also often are aging and there might be health issues. For example, my coming back to India was driven by my father's health condition. So I find that we hit on these three fronts. Second is I find that very often this is the time where we've gathered adequate data about ourselves for us to start make meaning. If you're 2 years into workforce, you're still figuring out what you're good at, what your skills are, etc. But when you're 15, 20 years in, I think you have data around what gives you joy, what are your superpowers, when do you thrive, etc. So that's when you start really processing these things. And third, I would say that's when also sometimes I notice that people's relationship with money starts changing. There's a bunch of people who've made all the money suddenly. And they say, now I have all the money, what do I do with my time? There are some people saying, I love my work, but I'm not sure if I can do this sustainably. Some people saying, I like my work, it pays the bills, but I'm not sure if this is the sweet spot where I'm distinctive. So I think the question shows up differently in different people's lives, but I think that's when also the multidimensionality of life hits you. You start, health starts taking a toll sometimes, relationships start developing creaks. So I think that's when I feel, I use the metaphor of moving from riding a bicycle to steering a ship. That's when you feel that you're steering a ship with many passengers, and suddenly the dynamics feel very different. And that's what I feel makes it. And also the paradox is, while the problems get more and more complicated, the mind space to resolve those problems also is diminished, right? Because you're so busy with many things. So when you add these two together, it's like a ticking time bomb for you to feel overwhelmed. I think that's why midlife is complicated.
So now it's one thing for you to say this as an outsider and as a professional who knows where the fault lines are. You can identify them from a distance. But what about me, who's actually going through that, not knowing what's wrong, just handling too many things at the same time? Like you said, I don't have too much time because I'm doing 10 things in a day and things are going haywire. What are the blocks to self-awareness? Like, what comes in the way? What really stops me from saying, hey, Deepak, I really need help. Work with me.
See, I think there are two, three things here, Anupam. One is, I think, do you have time to just reflect on what's going on? Or are you just, sometimes we use the term, right? Are you a doing monster? You have a to-do list and you check everything off. But are you making enough time for just being and not doing anything, but just sort of watching yourself in the movies, if you will, right? We are so busy consumed being in the movie, but we don't sort of go to the audience seat and watch ourselves in the movie. That's one. Second, we spoke about briefly, what's the quality of the feedback around you, right? Both at work and otherwise. Are you having, is there psychological safety around you for people to speak up to you,
Sure.
right? For you to gather what's going on. And third is really, sometimes, even if you had all the data, you need somebody to help you with meaning making, right? And sometimes mentors play the role, sometimes coaches play the role. So I think the biggest blocks, and lastly, I think it's technology, right? I think we are living in a world with so much grabbing our attention. And what we don't realize is while there's an element of being distracted as a result of this, the other element also is that people are not able to get in touch with themselves. This plus the media also in a way presents the best 5% of other people's lives. So I think when you combine these two, these few variables, it's a recipe for mental health issues, right? Which we are seeing. There's a tsunami of mental health. So I think it's a combination of these few things which is causing angst.
I really wonder, how much of that is driven by people who belong to a generation now dealing with stuff that is something that neither they nor the prior generation faced. Do you think that plays a role by any chance?
I think so.
Ethics, values, what was...
Again, these are all strong words. I want to be mindful of using them. See, I must also say the current generation is probably a lot more environment conscious and sort of has a sense of responsibility compared to some of the earlier generations, including myself. So I don't want to paint any generation with a broad brush. But I think people who've grown up only in a sort of digital devices kind of an environment, it is a challenge to sort of be in touch with yourself, not succumb to the pressure of the Instagram and the other things that are going on around.
What I'm driving at also out here is, the situations that you mentioned early on, for people to realize that they need coaching, stuff about environmental conscious, realizing that you've made enough money and now what to do next. I said there was a laundry list of pointers. Now, I find some echoes there in people who have just who've just entered the working cycle, and after a couple of years, they just feel I don't know what's happening out here. Maybe it's a generational thing, maybe it's not, I don't know. All the best to people who find that their first job is the job that they want to be in. Sometimes they find the work pressure is too much, how much of that, so that's one point that I just wanted to make to the audience out here, that this doesn't necessarily have to be only about midlife people or about C-suite people. There are a lot of things that you can learn at any point of your career. You want to say something on that?
And if I may build on that, I think there is I like the work of a gentleman called Barry Schwartz, who's written a book called Paradox of Choice. Okay. He's a professor at Berkeley. And he says, let's take entertainment, right? When I was growing up, we had only Doordarshan, right? In 1993, when I moved to engineering college, we had DD Metro. That was like 100% increase in our entertainment.
One became two.
Correct. One became two. Now you look at the number of entertainment options, right? Number of channels that are coming through Tata Sky or wherever, the number of OTT platforms, plus WhatsApp, plus Insta, plus whatever, you get the picture.
Yeah.
Now you would assume that with all this, the child of today would be happier than the child of, let's say, 1985 or in 1990. But I'm not sure. I don't think anyone has done research, but intuitively I can say 50-50.
Yeah.
Now, Barry Schwartz says that when there's an abundance of choice, two things happen. One is decision making becomes complex.
Yeah.
Right? Earlier, Mahabharat came at 10 o'clock, we sat and watched. There was no choice to be made.
Yeah.
Today, there are should I watch it on Netflix, Amazon Prime, or should I just do it on YouTube, or should I do something else, etc., etc. So decision making becomes complex. And two, there's FOMO, right? There are 100 choices and you pick one path. There are 99 other things you've done. So you go to bed sleeping, did I miss, there's a sort of, did I miss something around the bend? Now, where this plays out, entertainment is a benign use case. But the real use case in my mind is careers. Right? Earlier there was engineering, finance, medicine, maybe commerce, and a couple more.
Lawyer, architect, whatever.
Whatever, right? There are 5, 10 maybe. I call it it's like a Vibgyor of a rainbow. Today the careers are like a shade card of Asian Paints. Right? Asian Paints.
Yes.
2,200 shades to pick from. Like neurology and computer science, you've got philosophy and math. Now, with so many pathways, again, paradox of choice plays in. You've got all the choices, but you're always saying, where does this take me? Do I belong here? Should I take a turn? Should I not take a turn? And that's why I think the only answer in a world which is getting messier and messier is to be calmer and calmer inside and self-awareness. Right? So in a way, it's not just midlife for senior leaders, but the earlier we can sort of inculcate practices of self-awareness and reflection and feedback. I think the metaphor I use is earlier it was like a racing track. So the car with the fastest engine won. But today, if we are navigating a maze, the one that will win you the race is the steering wheel, not the engine. So and the steering wheel is self-awareness.
So that applies to people across the age and across the demographic, folks. So which is why I think the book is a really interesting thing that you should consider. 360s. One is, what are 360s? Okay. I mean, you've of course spoken about it a lot in the book. And how effective are they in defining the road ahead?
There's a chapter in the book called How 360 and 365 is your 360. Right?
Okay.
And what I mean by that is 360 is often a term used in the work context, right? Which is basically a company runs a survey of the people around you to get some feedback on what you're doing well and what you could do better. And I make a couple of points, right? One is it really a 360? Because the people around you at work are only a fraction of the people you interact with that can give you good quality data. So that's why I say typically I include spouse, friends, past colleagues, etc. Because then it's a true 360, which is everybody around you.
And they're invested in you also.
Invested in you. There's a reason for them to give you good quality feedback, constructive feedback. Second is workplace feedback is often structured around how to grow. The work feedback is basically saying how can Anupam do his job better and what is he not doing well. Now that doesn't inform the where to go. So if yes, the workplace feedback will help you move from maybe role X to role X plus 1. But if you're really saying what's the pathway for me, unfortunately the workplace feedback has absolutely no guidance. And I make the case in the book that that's a project that we all have to run for ourselves. The HR department of the company is not in the business of unlocking your potential. You're in the business of unlocking your potential. So those are the two thoughts in the context of 360.
Yeah. Now just wrapping everything up into takeaways for our audience also. Flavor. FLAVOUR. What is the notion and how does one reach there?
So I was trying to find a language which is intuitive and simple for people to apply to lead a full life. So the subtitle of the book is Lead a Full Life and Become the Best You. At least my belief is if we all want to play the long game, if we play a holistic game and pace ourselves, hopefully we can sort of play that infinite game. So first is we need to sort of focus on the family element. And there are multiple lenses to this. Our operating system is wired from the family context, so tuning into that. There are transitions underway within the family. It might be maternity, it might be empty nesting, it might be retirement, it might be a loss of a loved one. So are we tuning into the transitions that are underway? There are sort of resources that are available. For example, some women are lucky that they have mothers-in-law providing support so they can pursue the careers. So women and men have to be thoughtful about the support services that a family can provide. So I think there is the metaphor I use is family is often the bass note on which the melody of life is played, right? Because that's the context and you can't be jarring to the context. So that's F, family. Second is I find people playing to potential, having some element of doing what they like, what energizes them. So we all need a recharge. And Ikigai suggests that we operate at the bullseye. But when I look around people, very few people are able to find jobs that they truly love. So you need to, for me, it's guitaring. Somebody, it might be gardening. For somebody, it might be pottery. So we all need to figure out what gives us joy and make space for it.
Sure.
A is aspiration and not ambition. Ambition, I find, is unidimensional. Saying I want to be, I want to have 1 million clicks on my website, or I want to be a unicorn, or I want to be an MD. That's one dimension. That's just your work. But I say aspiration, can we think multidimensionally across the various identities we carry? Can we sort of take a baby step in the right direction? So that's A. VO is actually seen as a package. How do we be of value and seek the opportunity? I use the term talent market dating process. As we grow senior, I realize that work or roles don't come in clear shapes and forms. Right? For example, 10 years back or 20 years back, I don't think you could have predicted that you'd be doing a podcast show.
Correct.
Or I'd be doing a podcast show. Right? So I think the real question to ask is, given my skill stack, given my skills, my interests, etc., how do I find the opportunity? And how do I date my way to exploit that opportunity? Right? And that's a muscle that very often, we don't have. And just like arranged marriage, if your first job is out of campus, very often you're not prepared for the VO, which often shows up later. U is investing in yourself, which is physical health, mental health, and capabilities and staying relevant. R is investing in relationships. This could be personal relationships and friends and so on, but also I think relationships are often a pathway to new opportunities. People often see one is, of course, You need relationships to stay happy. But I think relationships also, in a way, open up like the 9 3/4 platform in Harry Potter that come from relationships. So that's flavor. So I make the case that we all need to strive to live a flavorful life. That's not to say we can tick all the boxes, but just like a business model, you need to make a set of coherent choices to have a coherent business model. I make a case that we need to be intentional about making trade-offs.
Sure.
The last point is in the middle is a circle which says rediscover your flavor. And just like Satya Nadella talks about hit refresh in his book, we all need to hit refresh with our flavor, because your flavor in your 20s is not the same as your flavor in your 40s or 50s.
Yeah.
So as our life context, the wheel of life keeps spinning. Yeah. So we just need to hit refresh and rediscover our flavor as we go through life. And just like in ice cream, we say flavor of the season. We all, as we go through our seasons, we need to find the flavor that's fit for purpose.
We've covered a lot of ground. I mean, I'm thinking Good Will Hunting, Harry Potter, ice cream, sports. So I don't know what's left. But folks, the book is Play to Potential. The podcast is Play to Potential. If you want to listen to a few episodes, you should definitely check out Deepak's work. It is really something that can be of a lot of use to you, irrespective of where you are and what you do. Deepak, our final standard question, which I think you've answered in many ways already, because you've dropped a lot of references for books here and there, but still, any book suggestions for our audience?
I would say, it'll be lovely if people can consider picking up the book that's just come out. I think How Will You Measure Your Life by Clay Christensen is a book that made an impact on me.
Clay Christensen, the same guy who wrote Disruption.
Yes.
He's written a book. Sorry, what's the title?
How Will You Measure Your Life?
It's a wonderful book. Think that he would write a book like that.
And it's a very thoughtful book where he sort of talks about business models, how businesses allocate resources, and sort of maps that to how we allocate our time and attention.
I would read anything that he writes.
It's a wonderful book.
Okay.
I would say a book called A Curious Mind by Brian Grazer. Brian Grazer was the producer of movies like
he's got a resume that is
A Beautiful Mind, Apollo 13, and so on.
Long list.
And he's written a book called A Curious Mind, which I think turned on a switch for me. He says the curiosity is sort of the meta skill for everything, in terms of self-awareness, in terms of relationships, in terms of sales, in terms of whatever, right? So he says, so in a way, when I read and in the book, he says that every week he tries and meets a different person. Let's say one day he'll meet a physicist, one day he'll meet a space scientist, one day he'll meet a marine biologist, and so on. And he says when you do that, the dots connect subconsciously and patterns emerge and movie plots emerge. So in a way, he was one of the inspirations behind the podcast. I said, maybe I can sort of go on that journey of curiosity and see how the dots connect later. So those are the 2-3 books that come.
Amazing. 2 huge books. With that is a wrap on this episode of Paisa Paisa. My guest, Deepak Jayaraman, coach, sounding board, author, podcaster, anything to be added there also
Work
soon?
in progress.
Work in progress. Deepak, thank you really for doing this episode for our audience. I think it was like refreshing. It was very different. It's unlike anything that we've done before. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you for having me, Anupam. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.